Good morning. It's such a pleasure to be here with you all today and a real privilege to be sharing the stage with my brilliant father. When we talk about building resilience in farming, it's often framed in terms of increasing productivity and efficiency or withstanding climate change and economic shocks. But today I want to talk about resilience as something much more human, about how maybe building resilience is less about carrying on and more about embracing change. So my name is Molly, I'm a vet, I live on the Isle of Anglesey, and I work as a programs manager for a charity called Stockfree Farming. I'd like to use my time today to share my personal story and then reflect more broadly on land use change and resilience in farming. So I was born in 1995 in Winchester Hospital, and for a young age I was immersed in the outdoors. My dad was managing the farm at Bedale School in Hampshire, and my mum worked as a research associate at the University of London, researching sustainable food production and food marketing. Growing up, I loved visiting the farms where my dad worked, gardening with my sister, hearing my mum's stories about summers spent milking cows and shearing sheep, and visiting our family in Sri Lanka, where the stories I'd heard from Dad about back home came to life. When I was 4, we moved to New York, and I found the transition to city living really hard. My mum still laughs about how I used to stand in the middle of our street in Brooklyn asking where all the grass was. But despite missing nature, I have really wonderful memories of these years. We spent our summers at Coney Island watching the Americans' weird hot dog eating contests, riding on the Central Park carousel, and I spent my days at my mum's workplace playing with endless supplies of stationery. When we moved back to the UK, a few years later I started secondary school, and Dad started the goat farm. This was a really formative time for me. It established my love for animals and for farming, and my dream of becoming a livestock vet. I felt that there was an identity attached to being a farmer and a vet, someone who was mentally and physically strong, capable, outdoorsy, practical, and respected. And as someone who had always felt a little different, as I'm sure you can imagine, there aren't very many mixed-race goat farmers' daughters in Kent, I was particularly drawn to that feeling of identity. Although we spent time on the farm as a family, those were years when I became particularly close to Dad. We shared the same desire to care for our animals to the best of our abilities. Dad's unique and often chaotic personality made farm work feel really adventurous and fun. I remember him pulling up on the side of the road and standing on the roof of our car to cut sycamore branches to feed our goats. He taught me to drive around our old fields in his pickup truck, and we always had an assortment of sick goats or rescued wildlife living in our house, shed, and garden. But alongside these moments, I was really aware of the growing strain that the farm was placing on my dad's happiness and on our family. There were many pressures: economic stress, the labour and time demands of farming, and Dad's increasing moral distress about sending our goat kids to slaughter. But as you heard from Dad, these pressures weren't something that we discussed as a family. We just justified it by telling ourselves that it was okay because our animals were better looked after than most. So I focused on my dream of becoming a vet, pouring myself into schoolwork and working on local farms. In 2011, when my parents told me we were closing the farm and moving to the States, it was a huge blow. And then when they separated shortly after, my life was completely upended. I finished school in the US, but academically, I really struggled with the changing curriculum, and I ended up being rejected by all the 4 vet schools I applied to. Once I returned to the UK, though, I slowly found my footing again. I spent a year working on farms, and then the following year, I was accepted to Edinburgh Vet School. Starting vet school coincided with Dad starting his sheep farm, and despite the distance, I played a big role in the farm, and I knew that Dad genuinely respected my input. I loved being a vet school, and I really did feel like I was living the dream. But the more I learnt, the more farms I visited, and the more farms I worked on, the harder it became to ignore my growing discomfort about what I was doing with animals. But these concerns felt deeply at odds with the identity I had chosen, and I was scared of being seen as soft, naive, or ignorant. I could see that Dad was struggling a lot with sending the sheep to slaughter, and there was a constant sense that he was always delaying the inevitable. He decided he was going to slaughter them as hoggets rather than lambs, and then he would sell them on so that he didn't have to slaughter them himself. Much like the goats, the sheep were also a huge financial burden. Dad was working full-time off the farm, running the farm, and trying to get the street food business off the ground, and as a result, he was really struggling. In my final year of vet school, during our slaughterhouse rotation, I made a decision. I decided I didn't want to be a livestock vet anymore. In that moment, it felt better to lose my identity than to compromise on my morals. I phoned Dad to tell him, and I was surprised and relieved when he told me he had come to the same conclusion. He couldn't do this anymore, and he wanted to stop livestock farming. After graduating, I worked as an intern at the Donkey Sanctuary, and then went on to work as a small animal locum, but I felt restless and disconnected. My dream of becoming a livestock vet had made me feel like I was part of something bigger, supporting farmers, feeding the public, and without that, my work felt oddly small. But I realized that being a farmer didn't have to mean being a livestock farmer, that there were many other ways of using the land. Inspired by both my parents' journeys, I began an MSc in Sustainable Food and Natural Resources and started working on a large organic fruit and veg farm. It was one of the best years of my life. For the first time in years, I felt genuinely excited. My studies challenged the status quo that I'd always accepted, and the physical work of farming invigorated me. I realized I didn't have to fit into one single box. I could be a farmer, I could be vegan, I could be a vet, I could be strong, capable, and practical, whilst also being compassionate, informed, and kind. At the same time, Dad transitioned to growing vegetables for his now fully plant-based food business. Whilst helping him research, I came across Stockfree Farming, a Scottish charity supporting farmers and crofters across the UK and Ireland who wished to move away from livestock agriculture into other sustainable alternatives. A year later, I joined the team, and for the first time, my work fully aligned with my values. At Stockfree Farming, we're a small but mighty team of 3, supported by 12 expert advisors with backgrounds in areas such as agroecology, market gardening, organic arable, soil biology, and agroforestry. We offer a free one-to-one support service for farmers, offering expert advice, business planning, market connections, and access to funding. We work with policymakers to ensure that livestock reduction and alternatives to livestock production are rewarded for their benefits to nature and society. And we carry out research projects, filling knowledge gaps in areas such as behaviour change, food production, alternative proteins, and dietary change. My work at Stockfree Farming has shown me that what my dad and I experienced is not unique. Many of the livestock farmers I work with are exploring alternatives because of the emotional and moral distress of caring for animals that are destined to be killed. With the mental health crisis plaguing the farming industry, we set out to investigate whether this distress contributed to farmer mental ill health. We surveyed nearly 300 people working in agriculture, including 115 current livestock farmers. Our findings really shocked us. They revealed that 56% of livestock farmers felt extremely to moderately morally concerned about their work. 45% admitted to suppressing feelings of compassion towards their animals, and 35% have felt traumatized by some aspect of their work involving animals. One farmer told us, "I get fond of them, the animals, and their different characters, and I have a great deal of respect for them. However, when sending them to slaughter, or even just to the mart, where I know they may be bought by someone who won't treat them as well, I feel terribly guilty, tearful, and I hate myself for doing that to them." Crucially, our findings show a massive openness to change. 63% of farmers would consider reducing livestock numbers, and nearly half would stop altogether if given proper support. This challenges the dominant narrative that farmers are unwilling to move away from livestock farming, and that livestock are crucial to preserving cultural heritage. But complex factors actually limit opportunities for farmers to make these changes. Reluctance to transition away from livestock farming is often a result of economic constraints and limited opportunities for diversification. In our study, one farmer stated, "We need to slaughter them to bring in money to feed our families, no matter how hard it gets." Institutional and structural dynamics also prevent change. Powerful stakeholders often shape the agricultural agenda in ways that resist diversification, influencing policy narratives and resource distribution, and reinforcing livestock production. Farmers are also impacted by sociocultural norms, rural identities, group solidarity, pride in feeding the nation, and inherited emotional ties to the land and animals all serve to make change difficult. A culture of silence and emotional suppression is prevalent throughout the community. Our findings showed that nearly half of farmers felt unable to talk about their distress with friends or family, and that many significantly underestimated how many of their peers shared these feelings. So when we talk about building resilience in farming, I think we need to focus on how we can recreate our economic, social, and cultural systems to offer farmers genuine choice. and inspiring, safe, and rewarding livelihoods. These systems need to be grounded in a flexible and diverse understanding of what it actually means to be a farmer. They must allow space for doubt, critique, compassion, and change, and encourage honest and often difficult conversations. Standing here today alongside my dad feels particularly meaningful. Our journey has evolved persistence, reassessment, and change. If we can support farmers to make decisions that align with their values, their well-being, and the realities they face, then I think we move closer to a farming system that is resilient in the truest sense of the word. Thank you.